Did you know that the Celts and the Romans were able to communicate with each other without translators? And that was one of the reasons why they were able to maintain a relatively stable relationship, both diplomatically and socially. And this allowed for a relatively simple exchange, so to speak, because there were also problems between these two peoples, which is something that didn't we don't see that in the relationships between the Romans and peoples who, unlike the Celts and the Romans, did not have Indo European origins. This can largely be explained by language. Julius Caesar reports that the Gauls, who were the Celts from what is now France, used the Greek alphabet, and the Greek alphabet was already known to the Romans. It was already familiar to the Romans. So you might be wondering, okay, but why did they use the Greek alphabet if they weren't Greek or Celtic? From what we can tell, they had already come into contact with Greek colonists and learned the Greek alphabet from them. The Romans were also already familiar with the Greek alphabet. However, it wasn't just in writing that the Romans and the Celts were able to communicate with each other with relative ease, but also in spoken communication. Julius Caesar reports that, for example, while the Romans used the word rex for king, the Celts of Gaul, the Gauls, used rex. In fact, rex and rix are very similar terms. It's kind of the same thing. When a Portuguese and a Spaniard try to communicate, even if the Portuguese doesn't speak Spanish and the Spaniard doesn't speak Portuguese, most of the words have a common origin. So, communication between a Spaniard speaking Spanish and a Portuguese person speaking Portuguese ends up being much simpler, even though they're different languages. That's what happened between the Romans and the Celts. In addition to this famous account provided by Julius Caesar, we also have other sources. For example, the renowned Roman historian Tacitus, who specifically noted that the ancient Britons, who were a distinct Celtic tribe inhabiting the land that is now known as England, spoke quite differently from the neighboring Gauls, who were the various Celtic peoples living throughout the vast region that we now recognize as modern day France. But both groups used a way of communicating that the Romans could more or less understand. And the reason for this is that both Latin, which was the language of the Romans, and the Celtic languages, all of these languages come from the same common root, which were the Indo European languages. Actually, the a common ancestral language to Latin, the Celtic languages, and the Germanic languages, which is the language of the Proto Indo Europeans. Since the Romans and the Celts had these common ancestors, even if very distantly, the Romans and the Celts were kind of like cousins. And that's why, even though their words were different, they were similar. It's because they were linguistically related, because both the Celts and the Romans were genetically related. Now, peoples who were descendants not of the Proto Indo Europeans, but of other human groups, like, for example, the Iberian peoples who lived in the south of the Iberian Peninsula, these peoples already had languages. Completely unintelligible to the Romans. The Romans couldn't understand, not even close to how they understood the Celts, what these native peoples of the Iberian Peninsula were saying. So, with a lot of effort, they could, of course, manage to communicate, but often the words had completely different meanings for the Iberian peoples and for the Romans. An example of this is the word peace. The Romans had a concept of peace that was collective. It involved the whole group, the entire tribe of Iberian peoples making peace with Rome. But the Iberians had a concept of peace that was strictly individual, it was personal. So both the Romans and the Iberians understood it this way when they were making a diplomatic peace treaty. But this took much longer than it would for a diplomatic treaty between the Celts and the Romans. And when this treaty was made, there was also a great difficulty in interpreting it. For example, The historian Appian reports that the relationship between the Romans and the Iberians was very frustrating because as soon as the Roman general or whenever the Roman praetor who had signed that peace treaty with the Iberians died or moved to another region of the empire, the Iberians would immediately take up arms again and attack the Romans. This happened because the Iberians' concept of peace was different from the Roman idea that peace involved the entire group. Their idea was that peace was being made with that specific Roman praetor or that particular Roman general. So when that person died, the entire group of Iberians would take up arms, believing they were no longer bound to keep the peace. The Romans, on the other hand, believed that peace was between the Roman Republic and those other groups. The Celts, much like the Romans, also had a concept of peace, truly collective as well. And that's why diplomatic relations were much more stable between the Celts and the Romans. That's because language is nothing more than a reflection of mentality. Everything you say, the words in your native language, are nothing more than the expression of a mindset. And the opposite is also true. So, when you learn a new language, in fact, you start to develop mental concepts that your first language didn't provide. And in this way, human behavior and relationships with other people end up being influenced, just like in the example I just gave. The Celts and the Romans had much more stable and lasting interpersonal relationships than the Romans and the Iberians, because the mental concepts of peace, of loyalty that the Iberians had were not the same as those of the Romans, because there wasn't a shared heritage, a common tradition between these two groups. But as for the Celts and the Romans, both had the same concepts, the same mental framework, so to speak, and consequently also a very similar linguistic structure, because both Celts and Romans descended from the proto-Indo-Europeans. I hope I was able to clarify things for you, and I hope you enjoyed this interesting fact. If you want to learn more about the origins of our Mediterranean civilization, please subscribe to the channel and follow for more content.